I was volunteering out last summer to Tampa Bay and to the CNPS-OC conference. I'm like to have to sit down on our speakers association. You're going to really enjoy it. Chris Cosma is a PhD student at UC Riverside. Going to finish up next year. And then going to move to Washington after that. Chris is a very engaged and lepidoptera, and their relationships with our native plants, particularly some potential for climate change and how that might affect interactions. The other thing I learned about Chris is that he really believes in outreach. He enjoys presenting his work and sharing his work with audiences like this, but also with privileged audiences that don't get a chance to appreciate nature and such. I really appreciate that about Chris, and wants to connect the young youth and the underprivileged communities to nature as well. So, without any further ado, Chris Cosma is going to talk about lepidoptera and plants. Those wrong terms.
Right, thank you for that introduction, and thanks for having me here. It's great to be just 45 minutes away from where I live. So everything's good to go here.
Presentation. Hello, sorry. It was a weird setting.
There it is. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. This presentation is about prioritizing California native plants for butterfly and moth conservation. And prioritizing here in a variety of contexts, just first of all thinking about how we can use our native plants in sort of a more targeted and data-informed way to support threatened, endangered, or generally just things like that are not doing so well right now with all these sort of pressures that things are putting on our environments. And I'll be talking about prioritization also in the context of using scientific tools like ecological network analysis to actually determine, which plants are the most important out there. Because not all plants, not even all native plants are created equal when it comes to supporting insects. I don't think my clicker is working. Oh, there it is. Okay. So yeah, most of my research focuses on moth pollination. So I'll be talking a lot about moths today, the underappreciated side of the order of Lepidoptera, which includes butterflies and moths. And throughout this talk, I want to convince you that moths are not. Where place I should be pointing this?
Should be working. Hang on. Give it a little whack. Look at that.
Is there like a
hold on? We're trying to figure it out. Here. Oh, it worked. I did that. Oh, he did it. Just say next. Just say next. Did that work? Okay. Maybe the batteries are weak.
Should I get the computer up here? Or?
Sure. We can do it that way.
At least from here, let's find out.
Yeah, let's see.
And maybe it doesn't have a good
we did test it, so don't suggest.
Yeah.
I can stand right here.
Was it a guy?
Yeah.
Right?
It's still not working.
I think the batteries are weak. Move it up there. Oh,
Oh,
just hang on.
I just levitate it.
There you go. Just need to get out of it.
Hold on, stop. My pesky water bottle. Someone put their water bottle in the middle. You just lassoed it.
Okay.
with your works from here.
Yeah, or just push the arrow. Yeah.
All right, so back on track here. So throughout today's talk, I want to convince you that moths are not these pests that they're painted to be, eating our clothes, invading our pantries, or flying around our faces at night. Although, they've sort of been vilified, moths are actually really important pollinators, number one, of many of our wild and agricultural plants, and they're a really important food source for a lot of different organisms, especially birds and bats. But before I get to moths, I want to visit a species that I suspect everyone is probably familiar with, the monarch butterfly, the most famous of all Lepidoptera. And you may know that just last year, the monarch was officially declared an endangered species. It took long enough, but it's officially endangered. And part of the reason that it was listed on the IUCN Red List is because of this long history of decline. That's probably the best studied demographic information that we have for any Lepidoptera species. And what we found actually is that the monarch butterfly has declined by, specifically the western monarch population that overwinters here in California has declined by over 99% in the last 60 years or so. And so we can see that, especially most recently in 2020, there was an absolute plummet in this population. Where they counted fewer than 2,000 individual monarch butterflies. And you can see that that was down from numbers in the 1990s that were well above 1 million. But the reality is that the monarch butterfly is a poster child for a much larger problem. And the fact is, here in the US, we actually know that around half of all butterfly species are in some state of decline. And those declines actually appear to be the most apparent here in the Southwest. In other parts of the Intermountain West, here in the heat map from the 2021 paper, that in the red is showing the areas with the highest decline in butterflies. And some studies by Matt Forth there at UNR has found that butterfly abundance in the Western US has declined by almost 2% per year over the last 4 decades. So every year there are 2% fewer butterflies flying around out there. And it's not just the monarch butterfly here that we're talking about. Dozens of butterfly species in the Western US are actually even more at risk than the monarch butterfly, including extremely widespread species like the West Coast lady that's pictured here. I know it looks like the monarch, but it's not the monarch. So we know, taking a step back here, around 240 butterfly species in California, and on average, they are declining. Now, what about moths, which are much more diverse than butterflies? We have around 5,000 moth species just in California alone. But we don't really know how their populations are doing. And it's mostly because we don't study moths in the same way we study butterflies, in the same way we study bees. We get a lot less attention. But there are some comprehensive data sets from other parts of the world, including in Britain, where they found a 33% decline in moth abundance since 1968. So just over the last 50 years or so, you can see this downward trend here. All right, so, this is all sort of depressing news. Why do we care about this, number one? Well, Lepidoptera, the insect order that includes butterflies, moths, and skippers, is actually one of the most diverse groups of insects. We have over 14,000 Lepidoptera species just in North America, and 95% of those are moths. So the vast majority of species diversity in the order Lepidoptera are moths and not butterflies, even though butterflies get all the attention. We also know that Lepidoptera are extremely important components of our terrestrial food webs. So as caterpillars, they are herbivores, taking in that plant energy. And then as caterpillars and also as adults, they are really, really important food source for birds and bats and tons of other organisms. And it turns out that in these two roles as herbivores and then as prey, Lepidoptera transfer more energy from plants to other organisms than all other herbivores combined. So they're the single most important group of herbivores that we have. And what that herbivory really means is that they're transferring plant energy up the food web. So herbivory is a really good thing, even though sometimes when we're gardening or growing food or even growing our native plants, we don't like to see herbivory. But when you see those signs of herbivory, what it means is an insect is taking in that sun energy that the plant created and transferring it up the food web to these higher trophic levels, getting that energy to our birds and our bats and all these other organisms. And so it is functioning food webs here that we're seeing when we see signs of herbivory on our plants. And so when we see those signs of herbivory, maybe we should, instead of sort of bringing pesticides all the time and trying at all costs to get rid of every single pest in our garden, we should remember that those caterpillars are feeding our baby birds, so they're especially important for rearing baby chicks. Some work by Doug Townley found that about 90% of the diet of some of our native songbirds are just caterpillars, and mostly moth caterpillars. And also, again, bats really rely very heavily on moths. Some of our Western bat species are moth specialists, where they pretty much only eat moths in their diet. All right, so they're important herbivores. They're also important pollinators. And again, butterflies get most of the attention here, but it turns out that moths are probably more important pollinators than butterflies are, and we'll go into some examples. But we know from a growing body of evidence here that moths are really important pollinators of both wild and agricultural plants. And some examples from agriculture, we know that they pollinate avocados and all sorts of different types of berries, apples. And here's a video that I took in my own backyard of my orange tree being visited by a moth. And there isn't, to my knowledge, a single paper in the literature showing that moths can pollinate citrus, but here it is. So they're out there just like bees are during the day, pollinating our crops. And again, there's more and more studies showing that we have vastly underestimated how important moths are to our global food supply. But we also know that moths are really important pollinators of many of our wild native plants, especially in California, where we have the yucca moth relationship that if you've gone through an introductory ecology and evolution class, you probably learned about this. The Datura hawk moth relationships, the evening primrose, which is also pollinated by several hawk moth species, and then agave as well, which is again visited by hawk moths. So you'll notice that a lot of these examples are these big charismatic moth species. Hawk moths are those moths that kind of look like hummingbirds. You may see them in the dusky dawn hours visiting plants, and they're often speaking to hummingbirds. But it's not just the large charismatic moth species, it's the boring, dull, brown-gray moths that you probably don't even pay attention to. And some of my other research that I'm not going to talk about as much today, I've actually found that around 60% of all moths out there are transporting pollen in our Southern California habitat. So again, just the tiny little moth, a couple of centimeters long and boring and gray and brown, is carrying all of this pollen on its proboscis. That was actually that moth's proboscis. Under a dissection scope, so you can see all of these pollen grains. And we also get some really cool moths when moths are all boring like that. Again, we have some really interesting moths in Southern California. We have our hawk moth species, they're roughly extinct. And then we have a lot of cool tiger moths as well. I think this is the Mexican tiger moth. And these are all moths that I've caught just south of Riverside. And so I wish I could present more on this project today because this is the project I've been really most excited about recently, but I still have to analyze the data. But essentially, I went out there to a bunch of Southern California habitats and caught moths with light traps, and I've taken the pollen that they're carrying on their mouth parts of proboscides, and I've analyzed the pollen with genetic techniques to determine what plant species they belong to. And so far, I've found, I've identified pollen from over 200 native plant species just from a couple of field sites being transported by entire communities of moths. So we have, hundreds of native moth species here transporting pollen from hundreds of native plant species. So again, this is all information and data that has never really been exposed before, and it's thanks to sort of these new technologies like DNA metabarcoding that we can kind of finally start to put together these plant pollinator interaction networks for our nocturnal pollinators, just like we have for bees during the day. All right, so kind of getting back to the main point of today's talk, which is not that word, but moths, as I hope I showed you here, are really important in our ecosystem, and so we want to protect them, and we want to preserve these services that they're providing for humans and for other organisms. And doing that requires an understanding of why they have been so impacted by global change. And it turns out that that is a really, really hard question to answer. David Wagner is an entomologist from the East Coast. In 2021, published a now pretty famous paper called Death by a Thousand Cuts. And this is the idea that there are just so many threats being thrown at insects from all sides that it's really hard to determine in a lot of cases what the leading cause behind the declines are. And more often than not, it's a combination of all of these different interacting factors. And that can be anything from habitat loss to introduced species, invasive species, to pollution, including light pollution, that is really bad for nocturnal organisms like moths. And then we have pesticides, and not just the pesticides that are being sprayed in our agricultural fields, but the pesticides that we use at our houses and all of our urban areas every day. And then, of course, we have the myriad effects of climate change, which can include everything from increased intensity of storms and forest fires to heat, and even flooding, which is something that a lot of people don't think about associated with climate change, but in California, we're realizing more and more that that is part of it. So, in some here, there's like all sorts of bad things happening to insects. But, one thing that we do know about Lepidoptera in particular is that they rely very closely on native plant species. And so the monarch butterfly, again, coming back to our friend for an example here, is what we call a host plant specialist. And that means that its caterpillars can only develop on very specific plant species, only in the milkweed genus. And so specialist species like the monarch butterfly are at greater risk of environmental change because they're more easily decoupled from these native plant resources. I'll go through a quick example of that here. So on the other side of the spectrum, let's take what we call ecological generalists. And this is just a species that can rely on many different plant resources. Maybe if we're talking about host plants for caterpillars, a species that can rely on dozens of different species. Now, the local loss or extinction of any one of those plant species is not likely to really affect that generalist very heavily because, again, it has all of these alternative partners that it can rely on. But that same species loss is going to very heavily affect an ecological species like the monarch butterfly because it's the only plant that it can rely on. And so the monarch butterfly is not alone in this specialization. It actually turns out that the majority of plant-eating insects are host plant specialists. And what that means overwhelmingly is that they're specializing on native plant species that they have co-evolved alongside. And so we're talking about host plants a lot here, which are these plants that are eaten by the larval stage of caterpillars, but I wanted everyone to keep in mind that it's not just the caterpillars that need native plant resources. Let's go through the Lepidoptera life cycle here to illustrate this. So we have our eggs deposited on the native host plants. We have the caterpillars, again, which we know are very highly specialized in the native host plants. Even things like chrysalis and cocoon placement requires or at least benefits from diverse plant resources. And then our adult stage here also relies on native plants, a different resource from those native plants, the nectar. But there's more and more research suggesting that native insect species also have preferences and sometimes requirements for native plants for nectar. And so just looking at these two life stages here, it's very clear that Lepidoptera need native host plants. Again, the plants eaten by the caterpillars, and they're native nectar plants, which are those plants visited and often pollinated by our adult Lepidoptera. Only by having both of these can we ensure that they can complete their life cycles. And so it's really no surprise that Lepidoptera declines, including right here in California, have been shown to be driven by the loss of these native host and nectar plants due to all of those factors I talked about: climate change, habitat loss. All right, so that's again a lot of bad news. I'm done with the bad news for now. I'm going to get into what we can do about it. So we know, again, thanks in part to the Moth butterfly lab, one of the things that we can do to help our insects is to plant native plants. Native plants support up to 15 times more native Lepidoptera species than introduced ornamental plants. And that's again due to these co-evolved relationships that have taken millions of years to develop. And there's been a fair amount of work to determine what we can do and how effective it is. And they've shown that even small milkweed gardens on private lands, people's yards and gardens in urban areas, for example, can contribute to effective monarch conservation. So everyone has a role to play in this and can play a role in protecting our native insect species. But I think that we can improve the way we do this, and I'm going to go through an example of that here. So, the monarch is at risk, so we plant milkweed species, and we see a lot of these signs and efforts about planting milkweed. But we can see that as the list of threatened or endangered Lepidoptera species grows larger and larger, the list of native plants that we need to support them also grows. And so effective Lepidoptera conservation in this era of mass insect decline requires moving from this restricted focus on individual species and interactions towards considering entire communities of threatened Lepidoptera, because entire communities of Lepidoptera are threatened. And one of the ways that we can do that is by using what's called an ecological network approach. And ecological networks are just describing the interactions between entire communities of plants and insects that rely on them. So, for example, here we have a plant community and how various Lepidoptera caterpillars are relying on them for host plants. And if you're analyzing these sort of network patterns of interaction, we can identify species that are either disproportionately important for conserving insects or insects that are also disproportionately vulnerable. And so that may include our specialist insects like the monarch that rely on very few resources. But it can also include these generalist plant species that are sort of playing these key roles in the ecosystem that are supporting many, many insects. And so what I've done in this work is taken a guide called California Plants as Resources for Lepidoptera. And this is sort of a naturalist guide that was compiled by Jeffrey Caldwell, who was at one point involved with the California Native Plant Society. I think he lives in the Midwest now. But this is a statewide data set of interactions between butterflies and moths and their California native hosts and nectar plants. It includes around 2,000 Lepidoptera species, 2,000 native plant species, and 14,000 unique interactions. So I've digitized and analyzed this data, and as part of this, I created an app called the Butterfly. And this is sort of the beta version of this app. Still very much a work in progress. But I encourage you to check it out. It is a web application, so you can pull it up on your phone to get the website, but doesn't work great on the mobile device. But this is basically a tool that helps people find these priority native plant species to support butterflies and moths wherever you are in California. So just to sort of show you how the tool works, you can input your address or click it somewhere on the map. And it's first going to tell you some information about where you are. So it's going to pull up your local ecoregion, which is basically what sort of like climate and habitat types are around you. You'll have the option to select a local natural habitat type. So maybe you want to plant a native grassland type community. You'll then also have options to filter for just host plants, nectar plants, or both, and for just butterflies, moths, or both as well. And what it's going to do is bring up a list of ranked plant species based on how important those plants are to supporting your local insect community. And I'll explain sort of what the highlights will be in the set. It's also going to show you a diagram of your local interaction networks. So these are our nectar plant relationships on the left and our host plants relationships on the right here. So this is just showing you how the insects around you are visiting and relying on those native plants. Oops. And really what we're looking at here, again, are these host plant networks and our nectar plant networks. And behind the scenes, this app is sort of analyzing the mathematical patterns in these networks, how they're connected, and using that information to prioritize and rank these plant species. So if you're analyzing this data, I've sort of come up with 3 important considerations for Lepidoptera conservation. Number 1, we have to plant native hosts and nectar plants. Number 2, we have to prioritize the most important plant species. And number 3, we have to consider geographic variation in species and interactions. And I'm going to go through each one of these. So starting with why we have to plant native hosts and nectar plants. So we see a lot of attention on pollinator habitats, which are usually focused on planting these like showy floral resources that attract adult bees and butterflies and other pollinators. And then sort of on the other side of the spectrum, we have a lot of efforts for planting the monarch host plant, for example. But again, remember that Lepidoptera rely on native plant resources at every stage of their life cycle. And so we have to consider both these host plants and nectar plants simultaneously. And we can do that by looking at these sort of linked interaction networks, which are describing plant usage at both insect life stages. And what I found is that caterpillars are generally more specialized than adults. So in our caterpillar host plant network, we have an average of 3.6 host plants per species. Whereas in the adult nectar plant network, we have an average of 14.7 nectar plants per species. So we see that the caterpillars are much more specialized in their, well, Lepidoptera much more specialized in their larval form. And that can also mean, again, that these species are more vulnerable as caterpillars than they are as adults. But really importantly, I've also found here that Lepidoptera use different hosts for the nectar plant. So what that means is that when we look at the plant community, the caterpillar stages are using a different subset of those plant species that the adults are then using as for nectar plants. And so while we see sort of a lot of focus on either supporting one life stage or the other, effective Lepidoptera conservation again means planting both host and nectar plants. And there is a growing realization that we need to be sort of considering both at the same time. This is a slide from the UCR Botanic Garden that is highlighting this important consideration. All right, so concluding this first section, I found that while the caterpillar stage is more specialized and potentially more vulnerable to plant species losses, Lepidoptera do use discrete host and nectar plants, and that emphasizes the importance of planting both to support the entire Lepidoptera life cycle. All right, moving on to my second point, which is prioritizing the most important plant species. So California is a biodiversity hotspot, and we have over 6,500 native or endemic plant species that occur. And of those, we have around 2,000 that are included in this data set as known host and nectar plants. That doesn't mean that there are not other host and nectar plants. That's just what we got data for. But that still gives us a lot of plants to choose from here. So we have sort of some prioritizing to do because I don't think anyone's planting 2,000 plant species in their yards. So I have met people that have done that. So the approach that I take to prioritizing species, it comes back to an old but really influential concept in ecology called the keystone species concept. And this is basically the idea that there are certain species out there that are playing disproportionately important roles in our ecosystem. And in particular, these structurally and stability enhancing roles. Basically, that without that keystone species, the rest of the community, the rest of the ecosystem may fall apart. And what I've known is that in California, few keystone plant species support the majority of our Lepidoptera species. And what I mean by that here is when we look at our entire host plant community, just 32% of those plants support a full 90% of the whole of the Lepidoptera species. And even more strikingly, when we look at our entire nectar plant community, just 9%, I forget the numbers here, 9% of those plant species support the full 90% of the Lepidoptera community. So again, that small percentage of our plant communities are those species that are doing the most work out there. And those are the ones that we need to be prioritizing in restoration and conservation efforts that are focused on protecting insects. And so I actually in the app take this even a step further by using ecological network modeling, which again analyzes these structural patterns in these networks of interactions to sort of identify these species with these key stability enhancing roles. And I do that in a spatially explicit framework, meaning that we're not looking at the entire state of California as one entity. We're actually breaking this up into just the species and interactions that are occurring in each location. And that's important because just like the species are changing geographically, the identity of these most important keystone species is also varying from place to place. So we can sort of perform this analysis at multiple different scales and also look at how these networks are connected across the entire landscape to perhaps identify plants and insect species that are sort of serving key connecting roles as well. So again, when you see this prioritized list of species here in the app, these are the species that have been identified from your local interaction as those keystone species, those ones that without them, sort of the structure and stability of that community falls apart. I did want to point out that this ranking method doesn't necessarily sacrifice our rare or threatened species, although we're sort of taking a community level approach here, not just focusing on the monarch butterfly, for example. We're not necessarily sacrificing the monarch or other threatened species. And so when you see these blue highlights, what that means is that that plant species is supporting a state or federally recognized threatened or endangered butterfly or moth species. There's only 20 actually in the state of California. There's only one moth. But as an example here, milkweed often shows up as a keystone species on these lists. They often see it in the top 10 plants. And that's because although we know milkweed as a monarch plant, it actually supports at least 4 other Lepidoptera species as a host plant and provides nectar for, well, this has grown since I last analyzed this data, but over 100 different Lepidoptera species use milkweed as a nectar plant. So in particular, it's a really important nectar plant. And not just for Lepidoptera, or, you may see wasps really like it as well. So, we're not sacrificing the monarch, we're still planting milkweed, but we're also planting these plants that are providing support for entire insect communities. All right, so concluding this section, I found that few keystone plant species support the majority of Lepidoptera species, and that this community level plant ranking system does not necessarily sacrifice our rare or threatened species. All right, coming to my last point, the importance of considering geographic variation in species and interactions. And so I've sort of already touched on this, but you know, California is a huge and very diverse state, and it's not just diverse in species, it's diverse in habitat types, and it's diverse in species interactions as well. And all of these things can vary with things like latitude and elevation and distance from the coast. And so, sort of coming back to our friend the monarch again to illustrate this, we know that it's really important to plant local milkweed varieties, and that's for a lot of different reasons. You know, planting the wrong milkweed species at the wrong location can actually confuse their migration patterns, and it's also thought to increase the spread of disease. And so here's sort of just a map with the different colors showing you the, I think around 15 different native milkweed species that we have across the state of California. And you can see that they all sort of occur in a slightly different range. And again, we have learned a lot about how important it is for the monarch to plant those local varieties. But this extends to the entire community as well. And so what I've done with this data is I've taken California's ecoregions, which are these sort of areas of similar climate and habitat types in the different colors here. And in any ecoregion that you're in, there's also going to be a variety of different natural habitat types that are going to occur around you. The CNPS conference was in San Jose, so that's why it's on San Jose. Now, across the habitat types, there's going to be our plant and insect species that are occurring, and some of them are going to be habitat specialists that only occur in certain habitat types, and some of them are going to be occurring across many different habitat types. But by layering this sort of geographically explicit data, I've been able to extract, again, just the local interaction networks for each habitat and ecoregion that's composed just of those species and interactions that are occurring there. And so again, just like you know, for the monarch butterfly, it's important to plant these local native plant species. I found that the identity of our keystone plant species, these most important plants in our communities, also vary geographically. So it's at a community level, also really important to consider the local interaction network and choose species based on those interactions that are occurring at each location. All right, so concluding this last section, I found that the identity of keystone plant species for Lepidoptera varies significantly between California ecoregion and habitat types, and that again emphasizes the importance of considering geographic variation when we're selecting plants for insect conservation. All right, so you may be wondering after all of this, which species should I plant? Well, I would encourage you to look at the app to answer that, because that's the best way to sort of, for your own house location, you can choose, oh, these are the plants that I should be planting here. But just to sort of give us some pretty pictures to look at, I've summarized all of Southern California, which is a hard task because zooming in, we can see that California has many different ecoregions. So these are just sort of the coarsest grain of ecoregions, or level 3 ecoregions. And so right now we're in the purple, which happens to be mostly concrete. But Southern California mountains, we have the Southern California and Northern Baja coast. I know some of you may live in some of these other ecoregions besides the concrete ones. So we have the different deserts out here as well. So just sort of looking at the Southern California coast in particular, since that's where we are, we can see that zooming in even more, and this is again emphasizing why it's important to get very geographically specific, is that we have, 18 different natural habitat types. I think you can probably guess what the brown is here. It's concrete. Some good examples here for Southern California, just in these habitat types here. Just looking again at butterfly nectar plants to begin with, We have one of the species that keeps coming up in all of my data as a really important nectar plant. For butterflies is a bitter dog bane. I don't know if that's kind of a yucky common name, but that's what it is. And here's the pygmy blue visiting this plant for nectar. We have Achillea millefolium, common yarrow, which is one of the best nectar plants. It's also a pretty good host plant for a lot of butterfly species. So there's the variable checker spot. Here we have a gray hairstreak salt heliotrope, which I think is a really cool plant. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is the California buckwheat, which is a very common plant species. I'm sure all of you know California buckwheat, but it turns out to be an important nectar plant for the threatened Hermes copper, which I think lives in a very particular part of San Diego County. So maybe you can't support the Hermes copper, but someone can somewhere. And then we have desert lavender, which I wanted to point out because it's a nectar plant for the endangered Kino checker spot butterfly, which we have in Riverside County. All right, going on to butterfly host plants, we have deerweed that's a really important host plant, including for the funereal dusky. Can't pronounce that very well. Here's a really cool looking caterpillar from the Bear's metalmark butterfly on California buckwheat again. This is sort of like where's Waldo, can anyone find the caterpillar in this picture? This guy's really nice and camouflaged. If you can't see, it's right there. It looks kind of like a little worm. But this is the Pacific dotted blue butterfly caterpillar on a different buckwheat species. And then I wanted to point out chamise here because it is again a nectar plant for the threatened Hermes copper. All right, going on to moths. So some good moth nectar plants for Southern California are rubber rabbit brush. Here's a white-line sphinx visiting that. Again, white-line sphinx. So a lot of the data we have for moth pollination happens to be daytime because that's what we have the observations like that. My other projects are filling in the nocturnal parts, so we'll get more of that soon. But here's sage. Sage is a great plant for butterflies and moths. It's a host plant for a lot of species as well. Then we have a really cool yarrow plume moth. So this is a type of terraphorid moth that kind of they call them the IUD moths. This uses common yarrow as a host plant or a nectar plant. Going out to the moth host plants, we have here's a sphinx moth caterpillar. You may know them as hornworms. The most common ones are probably eating your tomato plants. But this is a different sort of sphinx moth on a prunus species. Then we have another really cool sphinx moth, the California clearwing that has clear wings, the day-flying moth on snowberry. This again is, I couldn't even find the caterpillar in this picture when I first looked at it, but it's right across the top there. It's super camouflaged. This is a little geometric moth caterpillar. Here's a picture of it where you can actually see the caterpillar a little bit better, but the coloration is just exactly like the plant, which is really cool. And then we have the Ariagonum parvifolium, which is, I believe, the only known host plant for the endangered El Segundo blue. Unfortunately, if you plant that in your yard, you're probably not going to attract El Segundo blue because it only lives in one specific dune system in El Segundo.
They select a specific parvifolium out of the parvifolium.
Oh yeah, like a subspecies. I didn't even know that. Okay, so. All right, so sort of summarizing this talk, I wanted to come back to that bad news that I gave you in the beginning, which was that the monarch butterfly was not doing so well. It suffered just over 99% decline in its population. Well, the good news is that, there's been a lot of attention to this. There's been a lot of efforts to, for example, plant milkweeds. And that is making a difference. So in 2021, there was a huge rebound in the Western monarch population, where we went from under 2,000 sightings to over 200,000. And then just this past year, 2022, they recorded an even larger increase, around 300,000 individuals. So, I just wanted to point this out because there's a lot of bad news out there. And the fact is that, insects are not doing well and they will continue to decline, but there are things that we can do to help alleviate that. And one of them is planting native plants, and it really can make a difference. Some other things I wanted to point out that you can do to help. First of all, my app is, like I said, a beta version. So I'm really excited actually to announce for one of the first times that I just got a bunch of funding to expand this idea to other insect groups, including bees, and hopefully to other parts of the country. So as part of that, we're sort of looking for user feedback. So if you use the app, even just the beta version, and you have feedback, please email me, or you can use the links that are on the website as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas for improvement. And by the way, this is a big working group that the funding comes through a working group that I started through the NC Moth initiative. So we are actually working directly with the California Native Plant Society and CalScape, and hopefully are going to be unveiling an improved tool in the next couple of years for the CalScape website. And then I always put a plug in for iNaturalist. So a lot of the data that I use in this application and in this research comes from iNaturalist. It's becoming an indisposable tool for insect conservation and ecology studies. And everyone can help this every day, no matter where you are. That data is being used to help biodiversity. All right, so that is it. I wanted to thank everyone who's helped me on this project, including my collaborators at the California Native Plant Society. The formatting got a little messed up here, but I'm working with a couple of folks from CNPS and CalScape. And then, of course, thank you to all of the undergraduates that helped me along the way as well. So, thank you. I can take questions. Yes.
When you capture the moths and count the pollen on the moths, you have to kill them to do that. Right?
Unfortunately, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's it's not my favorite part of my job, but unfortunately to get that data, that's really the only way to do it. Yep.
I was curious, you were saying that you were analyzing pollen. How could you do that under machines for that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's genetic analysis. So essentially, when you take the pollen, you break it up, you extract the DNA using molecular tools, and then you can sequence that DNA. And then we have like massive databases now that know these DNA sequences and what species they belong to, and so I can compare my DNA against those databases to determine, okay, this pollen came from this salvia species or whatever it is. So it's a long process. I spent a lot of long hours in the lab, and I'm glad to be done with that.
What camera system or methods do you use to take the nighttime sort of camera trap pictures?
Oh, did I show the pictures here? I don't. Well, I'm not good at photography, so I don't really take a lot of pictures. But my friend came out to the field with me one time and had a big camera set up and took like action shots of me in the field. But I don't photograph the moths themselves in the field. The moth photos that you saw here was all done in the lab. But yeah, there's some pretty cool nighttime photography tools out there now, and a lot of people actually are using them for research now to actually like identify moths at night in the field, and that's a non-invasive way to sort of examine which moths are out there. Yeah.
I had for my backyard, I had a massive amount of narrow-leaf milkweed this past summer, and we had lots of monarchs. And it was obvious when you looked at the spent chrysalis, which ones were successful.
Mm-hmm.
What happens when the chrysalis turns black, or you end up seeing the butterfly in the chrysalis, and you know it never pops out?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a butterfly expert, but I believe that when that happens, it could be a variety of things. It could be parasitism. So insects have a lot of parasites. And in fact, like on my milkweed at my house last year, not a single caterpillar developed. And I saw that some of them were being parasitized by wasps or whatever it is. So that it could be that. But you know, there's a lot of other things, like I mentioned, that are killing insects. So it's possible that it was exposed to a pesticide and then died in the cocoon. But that's also like, you know, a natural part of, you know, life in general. Some of them just aren't going to make it. But I would say, like, if you're seeing that like every single individual is dying, then there's probably some local factor at play there that we should investigate. Any other questions?
Well, just a comment. Over in Passion Valley, there's a Tony garden store, Rogers Gardens, maybe you've heard of it. And it's interesting, they will not sell tropical milkweed, they'll only sell California.
That's great. I tried to get I tried to get our local nursery to stop selling the tropical milkweed, but they basically laughed at me. So some of them are receptive, some are not, but the culture is definitely changing. Like people are becoming more aware that it's bad to plant certain types of milkweed, and it's a complex issue because everyone's told to plant milkweed, and it's sort of like after the fact that we're like, actually don't plant that kind though. So, you know, the general public is like, I thought I was supposed to plant this. So from the scientific community, there needs to be better education and outreach about that stuff as well. But good to hear that things are changing. Did you in the back have
I just was wondering, Housecape has the advanced search where you can put in your area code, zip code, and give specific plans to that area. I mean, obviously you can do that and you can benefit more diversity. But I just wonder, how serious would that be? Your feeling about that? If we should try to go more that way, or any means of that works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, CalScape is really a leader in sort of like, first of all, bringing attention to native landscaping in general, but also these tools to sort of, again, get very specific to where you live and which plants you should be choosing. So I would say that, yeah, the CalScape tool is great. What I'm specifically working with them to do is, number one, make it a little bit more ecologically relevant. So a lot of times, like, which plants are chosen for which location may be based sometimes on artificial boundaries like county lines and stuff like that. And also number two, to add more of the interaction data. So actually like sort of adding that ranking as a factor in their algorithm. Because when you go into CalScape, I forget if this is in the plant, the garden planner or just the regular tool, but you can actually like specify like, you know, my priority is I want something that's drought tolerant and stuff like that. So one of the priorities that we're going to work to put in there is I want something that supports butterflies in my area, or I want something that is a host plant for moths or something like that. So yeah, there's a lot to be done, and that's why I'm so excited to be working with CNPS on this. And it's all based around that idea that we need to get very locally specific. As specific as possible, because for the biodiversity, ecologically, they're operating at that local scale. And so you can't, it doesn't really make a ton of sense to plant a Northern California species in Southern California, or even maybe a species that is from a different habitat type that may be in your county, but it doesn't occur around you. So.
Through letters and direct action, I was able to, over the course of 3 years, I was able to get 2 Home Depots for stuff.
That's great. Yeah, we need more of that. We're actually the missing component now. Like, there's more awareness from certain communities about planting native plants, but what we're sort of exploring in the working group too that I've established is connecting it to the commercial side, and making sure that these native plants are actually available. Because, you know, like, I sometimes feel silly standing up and telling people, like, you know, you need to plant this plant here. Like, if they go online and can't find that plant anywhere for sale or anywhere at a local nursery, it doesn't make a difference. So that's like the essential next step here is getting the nurseries and the horticultural industry involved.
We've been doing a little return site for the monarchs, and they were saying that people shouldn't plant milkweed when they live near or winter site. But in Southern California, in our area, there are different places that the monarchs have overwintered, and they're sometimes illegal, but some are along the coast, so
yeah, so my understanding is that it is thought that you should not plant milkweed within 5 miles of the coast if you live basically below Santa Barbara. And so I think it's thought, and again, it's not well studied, but like milkweed historically didn't occur naturally in those areas, and also it's thought that it may interfere with their overwintering patterns. It kind of comes back to this idea of like planting plant species that were not historically or evolutionarily in those areas can confuse the organisms that have co-evolved through millions of years to have certain plants at specific areas in a certain phenotype at a certain time of year. So that's something I need to fix in my app, because right now it tells people to plant milkweed near the coast, so I need to take out that information.
So 2 things, the rangers,
I think there's a
I pronounced 10 miles.
It's 10 miles, yeah.
But
Yeah.
because there's this side of that, but I don't know. And then the other thing is that with monarchs, aren't there some that don't migrate? So are they overwintering the same like eucalyptus, or are they just flying around our neighborhoods as they don't?
Yeah, this is where my limit of knowledge on the monarch so else.
Hi, Mabel. I'm the Xerces coordinator for Orange County with monarch stuff. So you got a couple of them kind of backwards there.
Okay.
Santa Barbara, all the way north to Canada, they say don't plant within 5 miles of the coast. South of Santa, right? It's okay. South of Santa Barbara, 1 mile. They don't want you planting within 1 mile of the coast. And I've had it out with them for years, nicely, saying that here we have milkweeds in Laguna Beach, right above the beach, right? They're here normally, and so that I'm the one that got them to change the 5 mile rule for anywhere south of Santa Barbara, because south of Santa Barbara it grows right up to the beach many times, and so they backed off on that, but they still put a mile in there. And then I told them here it grows very close. You can stand next to a milkweed and look at the waves. and so they really should drop that for here, but how far down? No one's really studied it. They just flip the coin and choose the 1 mile thing.
Yeah, and that was what I heard, is that like these were like sort of old rules that no one actually verified was like
right.
Correct.
They just kind of picked a 5 mile and applied it to the whole Pacific coast, and then they backed off on Santa Barbara and south, right, within 1 mile. But still here milkweed occurs naturally right above the water. And
Well,
so.
thank you for correcting me, because I'm a moth guy, so I didn't. Mine the butterflies, but I don't know.
The butterflies are just derived moths.
Yeah.
We all know that.
That's exactly it.
So that's the thing. So a lot of places get it wrong. And we'll do one more. On the question of wrong, here's wrong. In the back.
Figuring out like what your microclimate and what kind of environment, like maybe you would recreate because you're in a concrete community.
Yeah.
Under your job.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So my app is sort of trying to get at that by basically what happens is it searches from your location in a radius until it hits like a certain number of natural habitat types. So even if you live in the middle of a concrete jungle, whatever the closest natural habitat to you, it'll show up on that list. And that's probably the one that you want to choose. To sort of try to emulate, but no, it's a great question because I mean, especially in these huge urban areas, it's an artificial environment in every aspect of the word. So I mean, in some senses, like trying to do restoration type activities which try to like recreate natural environments may not even make a lot of sense anymore because we change the environment so much. And that's something we're going to be looking at in the working group is like, how do these things differ when you're in maybe like a rural area versus an urban area? Like, should our plant choices be, you know, dictated based on like your sort of like urban and local environment as well? But I would say check Calscape because their recommendations are usually really good. And I think a lot of people here can probably give you really good information about what species do well in their areas, because a lot of times in urban areas it's about which of these like cultivated species actually can establish and do well in our yards and gardens.
One more,
yeah.
Any thoughts on like density of like, you know, there are 2,000 plants, you know, in this area? Would you say like focusing on a few and having a lot of them from the yard is better than, you know, here's your plant,
yeah, that's a great question too. So I know generally they've shown that like more plants is always better. So although like I said, like even small milkweed patches have been shown to be helping the monarch. They know that the larger those patches are, the better it is for the insects. So like what I always tell people is if you have space, you know, it's usually good to plant more plants than just like one pot in a yard full of grass. But if you only have enough space for a couple of plants, then that's better than nothing. And in terms of the diversity of the plantings, variety is also good. So like one of the things we're going to be careful about in apps like mine is that we don't tell everyone to just always pick the first plant, because then we're going to have like whole areas where everyone only has one type of plant in their yards, and that's biotic homogenization, which is usually bad. So, you know, when you see these sort of prioritized lists or planting lists from the Riverside Society, try to pick a couple species. And if you really can, try to pick a couple of nectar plants and a couple of host plants. So that's really, it's important for the Lepidoptera. They need to complete the life cycle. They need both of those types of plants for that.
You should randomize the order they come up on the page for each person.
We thought of that seriously.
So,
all right, thanks again, everyone.
moral of the story is plant native plants. Thank you, Frank. Thank you all. Drive safe. Did you like the location? You must have, because you came.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Take the plant. Yeah.
Oh yeah, there's still some plants in the back. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I
Oh, it's only yeah. Oh, it's not yeah, they did looking at like the county background, it's like